The next thing that I want to talk about is the background to East African Christianity. The big point that I try to make in the background to Christianity in that black book, The Global Church, is that God was preparing the world to receive the gospel, not just preparing the Roman Empire. One of the things that Christian historians have often done is to say it was providential that all these things happened in the Roman Empire so that they would be ready for the gospel. Well, that's true, but the same things were happening outside the Roman Empire and the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere as well. And I talk about them in the PowerPoint, and they are in chapter 1 of that book. But let me just mention those briefly, and then what I want to focus on is Ethiopia's pre-Christian history for just a few minutes. In the book, I talk about 4 major ways that the Lord was preparing the world for the gospel. One is that you have a world of interacting empires. In the 2nd millennium BC, the great empires were relatively independent from each other. So they were interacting with small kingdoms on their edges, but they weren't interacting with each other. In the 1st millennium BC, the great empires, China, India, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, Assyria, began to interact with each other. They began to fight with each other over territory. One of the things that that does is that it brings the known world into contact with each other so that news begins to travel much more quickly, which helps to prepare the way for the gospel. Now, a second thing that the Lord is doing is creating a situation of very advanced transportation and communication. Again, the Western historians talk about how great the communication was in the Roman Empire, and it was. But it was also uniquely good in the 1st century AD in all of Asia and Africa as well. The great rivers, well, not all of Africa and Asia, but most of Asia and the northern part of Africa. The great rivers, the Nile, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, enabled easy communication. And increasingly good roads were being built, although not so much in Africa, but connecting Europe and Asia. They were increasingly good roads, enabling really fast communication. So interacting empires, advanced communication and transportation. A third thing that was going on as the calendar turned from BC to AD was that you have an increasing amount of religious ferment and conversation. There were lots of different religions that were coming into contact with each other, and Judaism was among those. So as the pantheistic religions of Asia are coalescing, as Zoroastrianism in Persia is coalescing, Judaism is in people's sights. It's something that they're aware of. And then the fourth thing that I want to emphasize, that I emphasize in the book and in the PowerPoint, is that the world was increasingly in contact with God's people. So Yahweh's name was known. His people, the Jews, were widely known across much of Africa, much of northeastern Africa, across much of Western Asia. And so in all of these ways, God was preparing not just the Roman Empire, but also the Eastern Hemisphere to receive the gospel. So I just summarize that very briefly because most of that is about other places besides Ethiopia, and I want to talk about Ethiopia next. But I want you to recognize that a lot is happening throughout the whole world as it was known at the time, throughout the whole Eastern Hemisphere, the known world at the time. And the gospel is coming into a situation where God has prepared people to hear the gospel, not just in Rome, not just in Greece, but throughout the Eastern Hemisphere as well. Okay? So that's all in the slides if you want to look at them on your own sometime. It's also in the book. But what I want to talk about in connection with that is some of the unique preparation of Ethiopia for the gospel. So as you think about Ethiopia, as you think about your own history, what is it that's unique about your ancient history? What do you think? What do you hear? When you think about Ethiopia as a region a kingdom that's going to become Christian in the 4th century. What is it about your history before that that uniquely prepares Ethiopia to receive the gospel? Yeah, yes. Okay, you have an almost unique presence of Judaism, uniquely large and unique in some other ways that I'm about to talk about. But you've got an almost unique presence of Judaism in what will become Ethiopia, in the Ethiopian highlands, as you move from BC into AD. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let's look at a little bit of the background to Ethiopian Christian history, and we'll show how important Judaism is in that. So what I'm skipping through here is what I just summarized. And let's talk about East Africa. Before I do that, let me ask you another couple of questions in connection with Judaism. How important is it in ministering in an Ethiopian context to affirm the Solomonic line, that the Ethiopian kings are descendants of Solomon, and or to affirm that the Ark is really in St. Mary's Chapel in Aksum? How widely known are those things among the people you minister with? You know, if you're talking to people and they find out you're a Protestant, are they going to ask, what do you think about the Solomonic line? What do you think about the Ark? Are those questions that are going to come up in connection with the Jewish background in Ethiopia? Or are they questions that most people don't even know about unless they live up in Tigray? As I've talked to some of you and others over the last couple of days, one of the things that I've heard frequently is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church makes too much of the Ark and makes too much of the Solomonic line. Okay, let's agree on that. Okay, yes, they make too much of it. They ascribe too much significance to those. But having said that, in the kind of ministry that you do, is the Solomonic line or the presence of the Ark something that it would be helpful for you to affirm, if you could affirm it? If you were convinced that it's historically true, would that help you or would that hurt you in your ministry? And I've gotten some different answers from you on whether you think it's possible or no, that's not possible. But if you could affirm it, would it be helpful? Now, Josh has already told you, I think the Ark is really there. He's already said that. And so in a few minutes, what I want to do is spend a fair bit of time telling you exactly what I think about the Solomonic line and about the Ark. And then I want to have this conversation again. Okay, after I've talked about those things, I want to come back to the question, if you could affirm it, if you agree with me, is it helpful in ministry here, or does it just get in the way of what's really important? So I asked the question to begin with here, and then I want to talk about the mystery of the Ark and the mystery of the Solomonic line. I'll tell you what I think, and then we'll come back and we'll talk again about this kind of question. Okay? So let's talk about Ethiopia in the pre-Christian era as background to Christian Ethiopia. First of all, let's understand the significance of the Hebrew and the Greek words that are being used. The word in the Old Testament is Cush, or the people are called Cushites, the Hebrew word. And then the Greek word is Ethiopia. Okay, so what do they mean? Cush in Hebrew is referring approximately to Nubia, which is Sudan. Do you know the word Nubia? Do you call Nubia Nubia, or do you just call it Sudan? Okay, so Nubia is along the Nile, the region along the Nile from Aswan up to what is today Khartoum. So it's the middle part of Sudan, the part of Sudan that's around the Nile. And that was called Nubia in ancient times. In Hebrew and in Greek, though, the words are Cush, referring primarily to Nubia, and Ethiopia in Greek, which was a very general word referring to any land south of Egypt where the people were darker skinned. So it could refer to Nubia, it could refer to Aksum, to what is today Ethiopia. It could refer to anywhere farther south in Africa than Egypt. Does everybody know the significance of LXX? That's referring to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, begun in about 250 BC and completed before the time of Christ. In the Septuagint, Cush is always rendered Ethiopia, which serves to sort of blur the lines between Nubia and Aksum. So recognize that in the Bible, Nubia is probably in view when they talk about Cush, not necessarily. But by translating it with Ethiopia, you get the impression in Greek that it's referring to technically Aksum, to the northern highlands of Ethiopia. So that creates a bit of confusion. So here's a map. If you see Egypt up at the top, you go up the Nile to Nubia, which would later be 3 different kingdoms of Nubia. We'll talk about that. And then you have Ethiopia or Aksum. And as you probably know, Aksum extended on both sides of the Red Sea later. In the 2nd and the 3rd centuries AD, Aksum expanded to include what is today Yemen as well. Okay? So let's talk about highland Ethiopia or Aksum for a minute. What have we found in early Ethiopia? Archaeologists have found a high level of material culture by the early 1st millennium BC. So 900 BC, 800 BC, or thereabouts. And that's important because that is too soon for it to be the result of influence from Arabia. One of the scholarly opinions is that the Ethiopian culture came from Sabia, the purple part there, what is today Yemen, but Sabaean Arab civilization was considered to be where the Ethiopian civilization came from. The problem is that we've got evidence of Ethiopian civilization too early for Sabia to have been the origin. So the Ethiopian civilization is older than the Arab civilization on the southwestern side of the Arabian Peninsula. And we see this Ethiopian culture mentioned in a lot of Greek and Roman writings as well. For example, Ethiopia is mentioned 5 times in Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, about 725 BC. And if anybody's interested, you can take a look at this as you pass it around. Here are the 5 passages in the Iliad and the Odyssey that talk about Ethiopia. Sammy, it'll come to you in a minute. You seem to be the most interested. It will get to you. Okay? Then, in the second half of the 1st millennium BC, from 500 BC forwards, we have the influence of some Sabaean culture, including a lot of architectural and engineering skill, which enhances the Ethiopian civilization that was already there. But unfortunately, the Sabaeans also imported their brand of pagan polytheism. So the Egyptian and the Greek gods, as well as the polytheistic gods of Arabia, began to be known in Ethiopia. Okay? Now, moving a little bit further in history, beginning in the 1st century BC, about 50 BC, we started having a lot of intense building activity in Aksum, in the highlands of Ethiopia. One very famous work written in Greek around the year AD 40 describes, do you pronounce it Adulis? 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 Okay. Describes Adulis on the coast of the Red Sea in what is now Eritrea, of course, as well as describing Aksum in the highlands. So the point of that is that the Ethiopian culture was well enough known in the broader world that it shows up in these Greek and Roman sources. It shows up in the Iliad and the Odyssey. It shows up in this work from about AD 40 and others. This was not an isolated civilization. It was a growing civilization that was well known throughout the ancient world. The coins that we've discovered archaeologically show the names of the Aksumite kings beginning about AD 200. Right, so from 200 and forward, we know the names of the Ethiopian kings. In at least the 3rd century, Aksum expanded greatly and began to control both sides of the Red Sea. So if you look at the map here, north extending into Nubia, so Nubia was part of Aksum, and the east into Sabia, or Sheba, what is today Yemen, across the Red Sea, and the highlands, and then some of the southern parts of Ethiopia, of Aksum. All of that was included in the growing kingdom of Aksum as it grew in the 3rd century. One more noteworthy thing, Mani, do you know what Manichaeism is? Has anybody heard of Manichaeism? It's a dualistic sect. Augustine was a Manichae for about a decade before he became a Neoplatonist and then became a Christian in his 30s. So Mani was from Persia, and he lived in the 3rd century BC, the middle of the 3rd century. He was executed by crucifixion in AD 270. He describes Aksum as one of the 4 great kingdoms of the world. So the big point here that I made before is that the empires are interacting. There's a lot more interaction between the kingdoms. And Aksum is at the center of that interaction in the 1st and especially 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. It's one of the great kingdoms. It's expanded, very prosperous, very technologically advanced, engages in trade with both Europe and Asia because of its location on the Red Sea. Okay? By the way, does this concur with what you learned in your own history in school? Okay? So these are things that you talk about. Your history goes back that far, right? Okay, good. Good. Okay? Now, I mentioned the various things that I'm emphasizing overall, but what I want to do as I continue to focus on Ethiopia is I'm going to skip this that I summarized, and I want to remind you briefly that Judaism was very prominent in Egypt and in Libya. Alexandria on the Nile, in the delta of the Nile, was one of the great centers of Judaism outside of Jerusalem. And Judaism was also present in Libya. So we've got East African Judaism on the shores of the Mediterranean, as we might expect. But as you know, of course, we've also got Judaism in Ethiopia, which is what I want to focus on the most. Okay, big picture, the world was familiar with the Jews. Smaller picture, there were lots of Jews in East Africa. A lot in Egypt, a lot in Libya. But what's most noteworthy is Judaism in Aksum, in Ethiopia. So let me talk about that for a minute now. Judaism in highland Ethiopia. All right, everybody knows the falasha. I'll talk about the falasha in just a minute, but everybody knows the falasha. Some of you have falasha blood. At least one of you has told me you have falasha blood. So everybody knows who the falasha are. How about the Kamant? Is that how you pronounce it? That word up there. The Kamant. Kamant? Okay, the Kamant. Does everybody know who the Kamant are? Everybody's heard of them, right? Okay, so let's talk about the Kamant for a few minutes. Up in the northern part of Ethiopia, in the highlands, the Kamant are a Jewish-related sect. I don't know whether it's particularly fair to say they are Jews, but they're certainly related to Judaism in a lot of ways. They still practice a religion that shows very, very ancient Hebraic influence. They believe that Mount Ararat was in Ethiopia. That may be a common belief. Do others besides the Kamant believe that? That Mount Ararat's in Ethiopia? Turkey always says, we've got it. We have Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey. But is it common here to believe it's in Ethiopia? Right. Well, Genesis describes the river that goes around Cush. It locates that. There you go. So, okay, so I may or may not come back to the Garden of Eden being in Ethiopia, but for now, let's talk about Mount Ararat, which the Kemet believe is in Ethiopia. And the legendary founder of the Kemet, Anayur, was supposedly the grandson of Canaan, the son of Ham, the son of Noah. So they've got, they're claiming a direct line back to the descendants of the people who went through the flood, going back to Genesis 9 and the flood and the descendants of Noah. Two things related to the Kemet is that they worship out of doors and they still offer animal sacrifices. And those are significant because one of the things that we're thinking about as we think about Jewish sects in Ethiopia is the question, when were they cut off from the rest of the Jewish world? So if you look at the changes in Jewish worship that take place over time, and you find an Ethiopian group that is still practicing practices from before the change rather than after it, then you get an idea of when they became separate. So when were the Jews worshiping outside? Before the construction of the Solomonic temple in the 9th century BC. And so the fact that the Kemet still worship exclusively out of doors in tents and that sort of thing suggests that they come from their contact with Judaism came very early during the wandering in the wilderness, during the time when the Jews were worshiping with the tabernacle before the first temple was built. Animal sacrifices, suggest that goes back as well. So what that means is that these are people who are descendants of people who have a Jewish heritage but may have been cut off from the rest of the world's Jews as early as Solomon's times, as early as the middle of the 10th century BC. Does everybody see the reasoning that we're using there? Okay, which means this is a really, really early Jewish presence in Ethiopia, way earlier than in Egypt, way earlier than Libya, way earlier than anywhere outside of Israel itself. This is possibly the earliest Jewish presence in the world outside of Israel. Incidentally, the Kemet have a number of pagan things that seem to have been mixed in with their Judaism over the centuries, and one of those is a very anthropomorphic understanding of God. So everybody know that English word, anthropomorphic. Okay, very anthropomorphic understanding of God. So the Kemet are evidence of a really, really early connection between the Jews in Israel and Ethiopia. We don't have any parallels for a connection that early in Egypt, for example. So very likely those Jews would have gone through Egypt on the way to Ethiopia, but they didn't leave any traces in Egypt, whereas they settled in Ethiopia, in the Ethiopian highlands. Okay, so this is something unique about Ethiopia, this really early Jewish presence. Okay? Falasha, or Beit Yisrael, or Beta Israel. How do you pronounce Beit Yisrael? Beta Israel. Okay, all right, thank you. Okay? So let's talk about the Falasha. So the Falasha claim to be from the tribe of Dan, descendants of Dan. They practice a pre-Talmudic form of Judaism. Okay, let's make sure we know what that means. After the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the Jews basically had to do one of two things. They had to admit that the Messiah had already come, which is the right thing to have done, or they had to figure out a way to survive as Jews without the temple. And at that point, they stopped the animal sacrifices, and they said that all of the temple services were replaced by prayer in the practice of Judaism going forward. And that led to Judaism as described in the Talmud, which is the main document, very large document of the sayings of the rabbis. So Talmudic Judaism or Rabbinic Judaism is an AD phenomenon. It's a post-Christian form of Judaism that is prompted by the severe psychological blow of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So almost all of the world's Judaism today is Talmudic and post-Talmudic in terms of the way it practices. Okay, is that all clear? But what you have with the Falasha is a pre-Talmudic form of Judaism. So they seem to have been cut off very early from the other Jews. So it's similar to the Kamant in a lot of ways, but the difference is that the Falasha have managed to remain less syncretistic than the Kamant and more distinctively Jewish, even though they were cut off with the rest of the other Jews. One of their characteristics is very strict dietary adherence to Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, and you'll recognize, of course, that that carries over into Ethiopian Orthodoxy as well. Okay? The name Falasha was given to them in the 15th century, meaning exiles. No contact with worldwide Judaism until the 20th century. And in the 20th century, a lot of them immigrated to Israel. So there are not very many left in the highlands of Ethiopia today. A lot of those have immigrated to Israel when they have had the opportunity to do so. The late 20th century was a huge period for immigration, both from Ethiopia and from Russia and Ukraine, of Jews into Israel. The first time I went to Ukraine in 1992, I was flying from Vienna. And on the way to Kiev from Vienna, there were about maybe 10 people on the plane. And on the way back from Kiev to Vienna, the plane was entirely full, and I was the only Gentile on the plane. So all of these Jews were leaving Ukraine to go to Vienna to get visas to Israel in order to immigrate to Israel. And the Falasha did the same sort of thing, although I don't think they had to go through Vienna on the way, in the 1990s as well. Okay? So you've got this very strong, very unique, early presence of Judaism in Ethiopia, maybe going back to the 10th century BC, certainly going back to the BC era, not coming from Arabia, as scholars frequently thought, but already having been there. And that's quite different in Ethiopia from the situation even in Egypt, which surely had the most Jews outside of Israel. Okay? Yes. Nothing direct. The same thing with the Kamant. We don't really know when or why. And so we have to go by practices they are following that are discontinued in the rest of Judaism. So that's what leads me to think the Kamant were really early, like 10th century BC, and the Falasha were well established by the 1st century BC, 1st century AD. They seem to have been there a long time by the time Talmudic Judaism begins to emerge back in Israel. But again, we don't know how they got there, which is why scholars can speculate things as varied as, they came from Arabia or something like that. One thing that you have to recognize about scholars is whenever you don't know something, entire scholarly careers can be made out of that ignorance. So somebody can say, well, I think it's this. And somebody can say, well, that's impossible. I think it's this. And you write these articles back and forth, and all of a sudden you have several people who have made a career out of this question that we don't have any evidence to answer the question. So that happens. There's a joke among scholars. You know what a lacuna is? When you have a manuscript and there's a hole in the manuscript. So there's a gap where the text goes across, and then there's a gap. So you don't know what's here. Where there's a lacuna, there's a career. Because you could spend your whole career guessing what goes in that blank where the paper's worn away. And then we're kind of in that kind of lacuna here as we talk about the Kamant and the Falasha. Okay? So that brings us to the question. Oh, I'm sorry. Not quite to that question yet. One more summary here. So if Aksumite society had been thoroughly pagan in the 4th century AD, I suggest that Frumentius would have been unlikely to incorporate local practices into Ethiopian Christianity. Okay, so let's think about this for a minute. Think about the difference between Ethiopia in the 4th century and sub-Saharan Africa in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century. We were talking about this on Sunday, Miki. When the Western missionaries came to sub-Saharan Africa, they found pagan societies. And so the attitude that they basically took was, we're going to reject most everything about that culture, and we're going to bring in Christian values, Christian teaching, Christian culture, and replace it. If Aksumite society had been like that in the 4th century, Frumentius, whom you call Abba Salama, Frumentius was his real name. I'm sorry, that was his Greek name. So I'll call him both Frumentius and Abba Salama. Abba Salama would have been very unlikely to incorporate so much of that into Christianity if it had been a pagan society. When Christianity is coming into a pagan society, you basically reject and replace. There's not a lot in pagan polytheism that is useful for the gospel, if I can say it that way. But when you come into a monotheistic society, like a Jewish society, or even to some degree like Zoroastrianism in Persia, it's a different kind of situation. There's more that can be utilized and incorporated from the surrounding society. So we know that Frumentius did incorporate a lot of the local practices into Ethiopian Christianity in the 4th century. I suggest if it had been pagan, he wouldn't have done that. So it seems that there was a pretty strong influence on Aksumite society by the 4th century, influence of Judaism, not just among a few groups, the Kemat and the Falasha, but among the society as a whole. The Solomonic temple architecture, the traditions about the Ark and the Tabatat must have been well established, I suggest, and Frumentius must have found them to be biblical and helpful to the Christian faith. Okay, notice that I'm making a leap here. This is me making a career out of filling a lacuna, except this is not the part that I get paid for. It's not my lacuna. But so notice that I'm making a little bit of a jump here, but I'm suggesting this is a plausible jump. Okay? So I suggest that the Judaism of the Falasha and the Kemat must have been a major part of Aksumite national identity long before the time of Ezana's conversion. This must have worked its way into the whole society. And Frumentius must have recognized it as biblical or biblically based, and therefore it was useful to him. So any questions about this? Do you see how this puts Ethiopia in a unique situation? It's the only pre-Christian society outside of Israel itself in which Judaism has really permeated a lot of the society. Not just that you've got Jews present, you've got Jews in lots of places, but Judaism has really permeated and filtered into the society in a way that I think we can regard as a preparation for the gospel. Questions? Do you see the point I'm making here? Okay? All right, so now that brings me to the question, what about the Solomonic line? Okay, let me talk about a couple of things related to this. So, Kebra Nagast, let's talk about the Kebra Nagast. If you'll know, I think, that it has a colophon at the end that describes the translation history. It is based on Coptic sources, and it's translated from Coptic into Arabic with a lot of additions during the reign of Lalibela in the 13th century, or late 12th or early 13th century. At this point, if it had been translated into Ge'ez, this would have undercut the current regime. And then it's translated into Ge'ez by a monk named Isaac at the beginning of the 14th century, after the restoration of the Amharic or Solomonic line. So Lalibela, even though he's the great master builder of the Ethiopian kings during the Golden Age, he was not claiming to be from the Solomonic line. It was the next dynasty after that of Lalibela that claim to be Solomonic. So this may go back to 6th century Coptic sources, but if you look at it in the light of when it was translated into Ge'ez, it sounds like a mythical story to shore up the new regime. We've had the replacement of one regime by another, which according to some stories was voluntary, according to other stories was more violent than that. But we have a regime change, and the new regime wants to authenticate itself, and it does so with a really grand story, taking it all the way back to Solomon. So on the face of it, it looks to be a legend for propaganda purposes, very far-fetched. So, main convictions of the Kebra Nagast: the lawful kings of Israel were descended from Solomon. The ark had been brought to Aksum by Solomon's son, Menelik I, which would then be in the 10th century BC. So, late 10th century BC, 920 or so BC, would have been when the ark was supposedly brought, according to this story. God changed his earthly abode from Jerusalem to Aksum at that point. So those are the main points of the Kebra Nagast. Okay, further points of the Kebra Nagast: Makeda, or the Queen of Sheba, as she's called in the Bible, was from Ethiopia. She had an affair with Solomon during a visit described in 1 Kings 10 and 2 Chronicles 9. Their son Menelik later paid a visit to Solomon in Jerusalem, and that's when the ark was stolen. And Menelik I became the first king of Ethiopia. So you all know that story very well, and I hope you don't just know it secondhand. I hope you've read it. The Kebra Nagast is long, but it's worth reading as the national epic of your country. So I hope you have read it. I hope you do read it if you haven't read it. All right. Now, reasons for doubting the story. It's much later. 1300 AD is what? 900, 100, 2200 years after the events are supposed to have happened. Okay, so that is much, much later. The Queen of Sheba has traditionally been regarded as being from Arabia. And I should say, speaking to Ethiopians, that tradition is not necessarily right. There's no particular reason why that tradition should be regarded as factual. It doesn't override Ethiopian traditions that she is from the highlands of Ethiopia. But nevertheless, she's been traditionally regarded as being from Arabia. Scholars have also, until relatively recently, not regarded Aksum as even having been settled in the 10th century BC. So she couldn't have been a queen from there if there was no there. If there was nothing in Aksum, she couldn't have been the queen of a kingdom that didn't exist yet. Or so the reasoning goes. All right? Now, on the other hand, some reasons for possibly taking the story seriously. Recent evidence shows significant material culture in highland Ethiopia in the very early first millennium BC. I mentioned that a little while ago. So the idea that there was nothing in Aksum that early probably needs to be revised. The highland Ethiopia seems to have had a significant civilization earlier than it was given credit for previously. Aksum included southern Arabia by the 2nd century AD. Could they have been connected a millennium earlier? If there were early connections on both sides of the Red Sea, then the Queen of Sheba could theoretically have been from Aksum, but people might have confused that with South Arabia because South Arabia was later part of Aksum. That doesn't prove anything. That's conjecture, but it's at least possible. More seriously, though, given how ancient the Judaism of the Falasha was, I suggest it's not unthinkable that there could have been a queen, from highland Ethiopia, however big a kingdom there was then, whether it should be called Aksum at that point or not. It probably shouldn't be called Aksum yet at that point. But whatever kind of a kingdom there was there, given how much early interaction there seems to have been between the Jews and that part of Ethiopia, it's not impossible that a queen from that area might want to go see the fame of the Jews who have lived in her realm. Again, does it prove anything? No. But I suggest it's not impossible. And then, to make a fairly obvious point, the idea of Solomon having an affair with a visiting female dignitary is entirely plausible from everything that we know about Solomon. I mean, for all we know, Solomon might have had a child with every queen who came to visit during his reign. That would have been entirely in keeping with Solomon's character. The surprise then would have been that he let her go back, that he didn't keep her to be one of his queens in Israel. So this, the idea that Solomon might have done this is perfectly believable. And then the thing that gets me thinking is this last point. When you construct a national epic, if you're making it up out of thin air, you almost always make it up out of something dramatic and heroic. The Iliad going to fight the Trojans over the beautiful maiden Helen. Okay, that's a dramatic, heroic kind of thing. Most national epics are about great battles won by the kings who then establish this kingdom. Why base a national epic that's so close to the heart of national identity on an extramarital affair? It's a very odd thing to construct your epic around. One of the reasons for doing that is that it's true, that it actually did happen that way. So these are some reasons for taking the idea of the Solomonic line seriously. So I told you I would tell you what I think. I don't think the Solomonic line is actually very likely. I suspect that most of this is a much later concoction. I find the story as told in the Kebra Nagast, and even with these qualifiers, it strikes me as not being very plausible. So do I believe it? Probably not. But the last point there has always made me wonder, or has long made me wonder. Why else would you pick this as the basis of your national identity, besides the fact, if it is a fact, that it's true? So my thought, the Solomonic line is not very likely. Not impossible for those reasons, but not very likely. And as you're thinking about this, is there any way you might use that information? You're working among a people, some of whom at least, really believe this, right? Really do believe this. Maybe a lot of the Orthodox people. Suppose, like me, you find it pretty unlikely. But you're working with people for whom this is a really important part of their identity. What might you then do with that? Do you need to convince them, no, this isn't true, as step one on the way toward talking to them about the gospel? Or do you need to affirm it with reservations? Or do you do something in between? Or do you just skip this and say, I don't want to talk about that, if it ever comes up? And it may not come up. From what you said earlier today, this is not the question that comes up very often. But what do you think about this as a way of, how do you position yourself with respect to something that's an important part of your culture, even if very likely it's not true? Okay, good. Thank you. A little bit more generally, one of the questions that I think is helpful to ask yourself, not necessarily to ask the person you're talking to, but to ask yourself, is this issue, whatever the issue is this issue really what's keeping the person from believing in Christ? Whatever that issue is. Is this what's really keeping them from believing in Christ? And if so, then I probably need to address it somehow. In this case, one way that I can envision that it might be the issue is if this is so much a part of a person's identity that what they're actually trusting in is their Ethiopianness. They're belonging to a privileged society that has the Solomonic line. And that's actually what is making them acceptable before God. If there's a person who's in that situation, then I can imagine this being something you need to address somehow. And I saw that all the time in Georgia. Not over this issue, obviously, but I was once told directly, for Georgians, the Bible is in their blood, and the gospel is in their genes. And whether they ever hear of Jesus or not, they are Christian. Okay, so these are people who were trusting in their identity as Georgian Orthodox Christians, as a special Christian nation, and were not trusting in Christ himself. So I had to address that. I can expect that kind of thing might happen in Ethiopia also, and that this might be part of it. And so it might be that you need to address that. But again, you don't necessarily have to address it by saying that's impossible, even if it is impossible. You can address it by saying the basis for your acceptance before God is who Christ is and what Christ has done. And he has done this for all nations, not just for Ethiopia. And it is people from all nations who turn to him, whom he accepts, not just people from Ethiopia because of their privileged condition. The condition of the Jews was great in every respect, Paul says. The advantage of the Jews was great in every respect. But it didn't make them automatically believers or automatically acceptable before God. You can say that the advantage of being Ethiopian is great in every respect because of that Jewish heritage before the coming of the gospel. That doesn't make anybody obviously, it doesn't make anybody automatically acceptable before God. So you can address this kind of issue by saying, okay, well, let's assume this is true. That's not the basis of God's acceptance of you. Let's talk about Christ. Without having to say necessarily, I have to tear this down first. I have to convince them against this idea before they become Christians. So as you think about things, I find it to be helpful to ask what is actually keeping them from trusting Christ, as well as you can tell. If this is part of it, then maybe we need to steer away from a trust in this without necessarily having to critique this directly. What do you think of that idea as a possibility? Would that potentially be helpful in working among Ethiopians? Just that, even if it is true, without trying to go into it. I mean, obviously this is unprovable for now. Who knows? There may, another set of ancient documents from Aksum may turn up in archaeological discovery. There may come a time when this is provable. It is not provable now. It's pretty hard to disprove now as well, even though it's quite unlikely. And so you don't have to deal with this. One thing that I think is helpful is to remember you don't have to dispense with every question they may have before you turn the attention to Christ. You can be thinking of turning the attention to Christ all along. And it might be that here, one of the best things is to say, well, even if this is true, let's assume this is true. We know that the work of Christ is for all nations, not just Ethiopians. We know that Christ accepts people from all nations who genuinely turn to him, not just Ethiopians. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about Christ. Let's talk about what he has done. Let's talk about the basis for his acceptance. Okay, you ready to talk about the ark? What about the Ark of the Covenant? Okay, so we have the Keber Nagast, and we have its story about the ark. We also have falasha, mostly oral tradition about the ark. Let me talk about what's in both of those first, and then I'll talk about what's in the falasha tradition that's not in the Keber Nagast. Okay? All right, so according to the Keber Nagast and the falasha tradition, the ark was stolen from the temple by companions of Menelik I. Menelik may have had nothing to do with it. The story doesn't really implicate Menelik in the theft. But the companions of Menelik who went back to visit Solomon after Menelik had grown up. The ark was stolen from the temple by those companions in the late 10th century BC. So we're looking at 920 BC, something like that. The ark was brought out of Israel to Egypt and followed the Nile and the Takezi rivers into Ethiopia. Okay, so there are two important things about this story. One is the timing in the 10th century BC, and the other is the route by which the ark got to Ethiopia. It came up the rivers, it came up the Nile and up the Takezi. Okay? Now that's in both. All of that is in both. The falasha tradition adds a few other things that are also interesting. Falasha oral tradition says that the ark rested in Aswan and in Meroya, in what was then Nubia, on its way to Ethiopia. Is Meroya, that's where Khartoum is today, I think. I think that's Khartoum today, right? Okay. So it rested in Upper Egypt, and it rested in what is today Sudan, on its way to Ethiopia. It was brought to Tana Kirkos, one of the islands in Lake Tana, and remained there in a tent, in a tabernacle, no solid structure, for 800 years, according to the falasha tradition. After Ezana's conversion, he had the ark taken to Aksum and placed in a church there. Okay? So that last event would have been around 340 or 350 AD, somewhere around in there, after the conversion of King Ezana. So if you go back 800 years from that point, then you get the ark coming to Ethiopia in about 450 BC, not in about 925 or 920 BC, as in the story of its being stolen during a visit to Solomon. Okay? So notice that what we've got here is two stories that describe the same route, but they imply different time periods for when the ark would have left Israel. Okay, or yes, when the ark would have left Israel. Okay? Is everybody with me on this? So this is implied in the Falasha's stories. Okay, let's talk about some other traditions related to the ark. The most commonly believed Jewish tradition is that at the time of Jerusalem's destruction by the Babylonians, 586 BC, the ark was hidden under the temple. So under the temple would have later been under the Dome of the Rock. The Romans destroyed the temple in 70 BC. The Muslims built the Dome of the Rock in 690 AD, if I remember correctly, around 690 AD, with the ark still under there and not known. So that's a commonly believed Jewish tradition. On the basis of that tradition, the Roman Catholic military order, the Knights Templar. Have you heard of the Knights Templar? Okay. The Knights Templar in the 12th century spent years in Jerusalem digging under the Temple Mount looking for the ark. They even dug under the Dome of the Rock with the Arabs guarding the Dome of the Rock at surface level. They tunneled underneath the guards and underneath the Dome of the Rock extensively looking for the ark. There are various European traditions that say they found it, and they took it back to one place or another in England or Scotland. Okay? But what's wrong with all of those traditions? Okay, there's one thing in there that's factual. The Knights Templar really did spend a long time digging around the Dome of the Rock. They never admitted what they were looking for, but everybody then and now knew they were looking for the Ark. That's true. The tradition that it's still there and the tradition that they found it and took it back to England or Scotland, what's wrong with those traditions? What's wrong with those traditions is the presence of Templar crosses in Lalibela. The crosses associated with the Knights Templar from Western Europe. And we have those crosses in the rock-hewn churches in Lalibela. And there are also some traditions that white men were involved, along with the Aksumites, in building the rock-hewn churches at Lalibela. Okay, so what does that suggest? That suggests that the Knights Templar did not find the Ark in Jerusalem, but what they found instead was evidence that it was in Ethiopia. Well, what might that evidence have looked like? Lalibela himself was in exile in Jerusalem for 25 years while his brother was reigning. And in fact, Lalibela was the one who convinced the Saladin, the Muslim ruler, to give some land in Jerusalem to Ethiopia. Does anybody know this? Okay, some of you know this story. Okay, so Lalibela himself was in Jerusalem for 25 years at the time that the Knights Templar were there. Perhaps he heard of what they were doing and said, oh, you're not going to find it there because it isn't there. It's in Aksum. On the basis of that information, the Knights Templar then seem to have gone to Aksum looking for it. And in the process, they took some of their engineering knowledge with them, which they also took back to Western Europe. The Knights Templar had a hand in building the great cathedrals of Western Europe. They seem also to have had a hand in building the very different but equally extraordinary rock-hewn churches in Lalibela. So that seems to me to indicate that this tradition is more likely than any of the other traditions. The tradition that it's buried by the Jews and still there, the tradition that it's in England, the tradition that it's in Scotland, the tradition that it's in Ethiopia. The activities of the Knights Templar suggest that the Ethiopian tradition is more likely to be the case. What do you think so far? Can you consider this remotely plausible? Some people are saying yes. Others are a lot more skeptical, right? Okay. So when Josh said, Don thinks the Ark is in Aksum, it might be more accurate to say, I think that is the most likely of the traditions about where it is. If it wasn't destroyed by the Babylonians. Yeah, and one possibility is God wouldn't let it be destroyed. But another possibility is because of the Jews' unfaithfulness, he allowed the Ark to be destroyed. If the Babylonians didn't destroy it, it seems to be me more likely that it's in Aksum than any of the other possibilities that are out there. Okay, as you think about that, yes, Sammy? Okay, yes, the assumption is generally that the Romans didn't find it, that it wasn't there when the Romans destroyed. Because on the Arch of Titus in Rome, Titus is the one who destroyed the temple in 70 AD and then became the Roman emperor. And he built an arch to celebrate himself. And one of the pictures on the Arch of Titus in Rome, and you can look it up on the internet, one of the pictures is of the Romans taking the Jewish worship devices out of the ark. There's a menorah that's very visible and they're taking it out of the temple. They take it out of the temple and they take it back to Rome rather than destroying it. So the assumption is that they would have taken the ark if they'd found it. They wouldn't have destroyed it. So that's the assumption based on that piece of information. Okay? So as you think about that, let's talk about the date when the ark could possibly have left Jerusalem. When could it possibly have left Jerusalem? Could it really have left Jerusalem as early as 925 BC? And I think the answer to that is probably not, or almost certainly not. 2 Kings 19:15 takes place at the time when the Assyrians attacked Jerusalem in 701 BC. And that, as it describes the prayer of Hezekiah, it talks about the glory of the Lord enthroned between the cherubim, which seems to be a description of the ark as representing the presence of God. So God was believed to sit between the two winged cherubim on the cover of the ark. So the description that we get in that passage very strongly suggests that in 701 BC, the ark was still there, which means it couldn't have left at the time the Kebra Nagast says, in the way the Kebra Nagast says. Okay, but let's keep going. So when could it have left Jerusalem? Manasseh, one of the worst kings in all of Israel's history, began to reign in 687 BC. And 2 Kings chapter 21 tells us that he engaged in flagrant idolatry in the temple. So one of the possibilities that people suggest is that the priest would have taken the ark out of the temple to avoid it being desecrated by Manasseh's idolatry. So where might they have taken it? Would they have buried it under the temple, as the later Jewish tradition says? Or would they have tried to take it out of Jerusalem altogether, to get it out of the reach of Manasseh? Let's assume for a moment that they took it out of Jerusalem altogether. How far away would they have taken it? Okay, so let's keep thinking about this. If it was taken somewhere away, somewhere out of Jerusalem, could it have been brought back? You can look at these passages on your own, but these all pertain to Josiah's reforms in the 620s. Josiah removed the Asherah, the pagan goddess, from the temple in 628 BC. So notice the pagan goddess had been there for 60 years, almost 60 years. That is really awful. Josiah removed the Asherah from the temple in 628. In 622, he asked the priests to put the ark back in the temple. Okay, so from that, we know it had been taken out of the temple at some point, probably during the reign of Manasseh, because Josiah asked the Jews to put it back, asked the priests to put it back. But at about the same time, in Jeremiah 3:16, Jeremiah turns the people's attention away from the ark to the direct presence of the Lord, which suggests the ark isn't around for us to be able to bring it back. And we need to come to grips with life without the ark. And we need to see God's face directly rather than through the ark. So the picture that we could be getting here is of the ark being taken during Manasseh's reign, and they wanted to bring it back during Josiah's reign, but it had been taken far enough away that it couldn't be brought back. Okay, is everybody with me here as a possibility? Now, let's turn our attention to Egypt. Near Aswan in Upper Egypt, there's an island in the Nile called Elephantine. And there is extensive correspondence between Jews in Jerusalem and Jews who lived on that island in Elephantine that goes from the 7th century BC until the year 410. So we have evidence of this correspondence. So we know there were Jews living on this island. And the correspondence indicates that there was a Jewish temple on the island, and archaeologists have found some remains of it. And it doesn't look like Herod's temple. It looks like a smaller version of Solomon's temple, from what we can tell. Okay? So the question is, why build such a temple? One possibility is they built this temple because Solomon's temple had been destroyed in 586. But the timeline isn't right, because this correspondence begins in the 7th century, not the 6th century. The other possibility is that in the 7th century, the ark came to Elephantine, and they needed a place to put it. And they built a temple to put the ark in. So the fact that the correspondence begins in the 7th century suggests Manasseh's reign as a possibility for when the ark was taken away, and maybe it was taken as far away as Elephantine. Now, the Egyptians attacked the Jewish community and destroyed it in 410 BC. So if the ark was there, that means that they needed to take the ark somewhere else. So where might they go? There were Jews farther up the Nile. They'd been there a long time. Maybe they should go there. And the Falasha tradition indicates that the ark stopped in Aksum. Elephantine is very close to Aksum. I'm sorry, in Aswan. And Elephantine is very close to Aswan. And it stopped in Meroe, Khartoum, on the way farther up the Nile. So let me suggest this as a possibility. The ark was removed in the reign of Manasseh around 680 BC, taken to Elephantine. In 410 BC, the Jews of Elephantine had to move it again. They knew other Jews farther up the Nile, so they took the ark to Ethiopia. There, they took it to Tana-Kirkos, where it stayed 750 years. Notice the tradition is 800 years. This is very close to that. From 410 to 340 would be 750 years. It's very, very close to the tradition of 800. It remained there for 750 years. Ezana had a church built in Aksum to house the ark and moved it there in the middle of the 4th century. And the Kebra Nagast is a partially legendary account written much later, but with a bit of truth in it. One more thing, and then I'll let you talk to me about what to make of all this. Isaiah 18:7 refers to Ethiopians, to a people tall and smooth, bringing gifts to Jerusalem in the last day. In the last day. At the end of history, in the day of the Lord. So what is the gift that the Ethiopians might bring back to Jerusalem for the new heavens and the new earth in the last day? Some people have suggested the ark, that you're going to take it back to Jerusalem for the new heavens and new earth. Now, I have no idea what God would do with it in the new heavens and the new earth. One of the things that Revelation says is there's no temple there, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple. They are the direct presence of God. You don't need any of the signs of God's presence. So I don't know what function the ark might hold. But nevertheless, Isaiah 18:7 is interesting, I suggest. Of course, it could be talking about any other kind of gift that you might be bringing to the New Jerusalem. But some people have suggested that that's the ark. So, in other words, I think the possibility that the ark is in Aksum is considerably more likely than any of the other possibilities about where the ark might be. If the ark is still in existence, my guess would be Aksum is the most likely place for where it would be. So that brings us to Questions?